Well, good morning, afternoon, wherever you may be. Welcome to ASEV Eastern Section Hang Time, Grapevines to Wines session. It is June 13th, and we are here today to talk about grapevine nutrition. If this is your first time joining with us, this is American Society of Enology and Viticulture Eastern Section. And this is a academic/industry type of an organization. If you want to learn more, go to ASEV.org. We have a conference coming up. Hopefully, there is still room to register. If that is something that you want to do, it's going to be in Cleveland, Ohio this year. You can check out our YouTube page to learn more about that conference, but I encourage you to sign up now. It's a lot of great information shared across the country. So that was last month, but we're going to get focused on today. A little housekeeping here. If you want to ask questions to our panelists, please raise your hand, the little icon at the bottom, and your name will pop at the top of the list, and I will call upon you and unmute you. You can also type in questions in the Q&A chat box, not the chat box, but the Q&A chat box. So we'll try to keep an eye on that. And get those questions answered live. So hang time is a good, fun, informal session. We're not doing a true presentation, but this is for all of y'all to engage with our panelists and just kind of have real conversations about these topics. We do have an outline and we try to get to, and we have an hour. And so we'll do that. So let's get started. So we've got one of our panelists. We're going to start with him on the telephone, Dr. Terry Bates. Terry, if you'll introduce yourself real quick to our audience.
Yep, thanks for having me on. My name is Terry Bates. I'm a senior research associate at Cornell University and the director of the Cornell Lake Erie Research and Extension Lab. And I've been doing grapevine nutrition work for since I was a graduate student at Penn State 30 years ago. And I'm currently part of the High Res Vineyard Nutrition Project, which is a SDRI funded project run by Marcus Keller at Washington State University.
Okay, appreciate you joining us today. Rob, we'll go to you.
Thanks, Nathan. I'm Rob Chancia. I'm from the Rochester Institute of Technology, working in the imaging science department. So I look at all sorts of satellite and drone data of different modalities. And I'm also part of the High Res Vineyard Nutrition Project on the sensors team. So we're looking at different sensors from satellite down to drone or field level, what works best for sensing nutrient needs within the vineyard.
Thank you, Rob. Glad to have you. I'm going to skip the two gentlemen and go with the ladies. Should have done the ladies first, so pardon my manners, Jennifer, if you'll introduce yourself.
Thank you, Nathan. Hi, I'm Jennifer Phillips Russo. I am the Viticulture Extension Specialist for Cornell University in the Lake Erie Regional Grape Program. I work with Terry Bates at the lab that we have out there at Agritech, and I'm currently working on a floor management for nutrition and water conservation and non-irrigated juice grapes. Work very closely with Terry and all of his nutrient work that he's doing.
Glad to have you with us, Jennifer. All right, gentlemen, Texas A&M.
Go ahead. You're younger. Well, howdy, live from Studio 66. No, I'm just kidding. My name is Michael Cook. I am an extension viticulturist with the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. I am a regional viticulturist, so I support our grape growers growing muscadines, hybrids, and European wine grapes up in Northeast Texas. So it's really important when we work with our growers growing so many different things across such a large area to hone in on nutrition. And so
I'm Justin Shiner. My title is Associate Professor and Viticulture Specialist. So I teach a little bit on campus, and then most of my job is on the extension outreach applied research side. So the work I do with nutrition more relates to, working with growers on their needs. And as Michael said, much of the soil in Texas is alkaline, but we also have very acid soil in East Texas with some blueberry production, quite a number of rootstocks, quite a number of varieties grown in Texas. So we get to answer a lot of questions and help interpret soil tests and tissue tests and things like that.
that's right.
Good deal. I believe that is everybody. So we got a full panel and a good audience today. So let's get rolling on grape nutrition. So we've got the outline today is kind of talk about field applied methodologies and things in the field. And then we're going to discuss kind of what is the standard of this analysis and interpretation of that. And then we're going to go back to a little bit of applied to fertility applications, whether that be foliar or through the soil. And then lastly, we're going to cover a little bit of the new technologies that are coming down the pipeline that we can hopefully expect some great output in the future that's going to help us even more. So the way we kind of rehearsed this is Texas A&M was going to kind of take the lead on some of the kind of applied methodologies that we're going to do at the field. Now we understand our audience may have a wide range of understanding of tissue sampling, but we're going to review some of the basics, but there may be some things that you learn here that we hope that you do that are new that you may have not taken into consideration, such as contaminated tissue. So anyway, we'll dive more into that. But Texas A&M, y'all take it away on blade, petiole, or a whole leaf. Which is it and why?
Sure. Yeah. So what I'll end up doing here is I will pivot or defer to Terry here in a bit when we're talking about timing of sampling. Most of the people listening are probably familiar with the Wine Grape Production Guide for Eastern North America. It's a good resource, particularly for those in Eastern section. And there's a nice chapter on nutrition that he wrote, and he'll provide some good discussion, I think, on, where do these ranges come from when you submit a test for, nutrition in your plant. So the quick, I guess, version of this is if you're starting a vineyard, because we deal with a lot of folks that are just getting started, maybe evaluating a site. Of course, you're going to test your soil. And we were having a little discussion beforehand, before we started, about interpreting these soil tests. And sometimes you see these interesting results. Here in Texas, we were joking, if we see really high organic matter, that might signal that you had some sampling error. So point being, and we're not going to go through how to take a sample properly. Point being is there's a way to do it correctly to get the best representation of your site, because even a very small block or field will often have variability in soil, yes, sometimes tremendous variability. And the more you can learn about that in advance and the more you can prepare for it, the better off you're going to be, because ultimately the goal is going to be to produce a uniform vineyard that you can manage as uniformly as possible, resulting, of course, in really good fruit quality. So we would start, of course, with soil testing, and then as you plant your vineyard, you would eventually start tissue testing.
Right.
And soil tells you what's there in the soil. It doesn't necessarily tell you what is available, because that's influenced by soil chemistry.
I like to say it's an indication of what's in the bank, but that may not be there at all points in time throughout the season, or it may not be readily available to the plant. But yeah, we got a good indication of a pH.
Would you describe your bank account as more like a sand?
My bank
that
account
doesn't hold much.
We call it gumbo.
I'm just kidding. I'm sorry.
So it's high CEC, heavy, lots of yeah.
So there are differences, as Michael said, of course, in soil and nutrient holding capacity, yes, and availability. So that's part of the interpretation as well, and that even will guide rootstock selection if you're going to have grafted vines. And then eventually you will begin testing the vines directly, because that tells you actually what's in the plant. And then there are specific parts of the plant that we test. It's either the petiole or the blade. And then it had specific location on the shoot and at specific timings. And the reason is, and this is where Terry can comment, I'm sure, at length, is the nutrients within the plant vary according to the time of the season or the organ that you're specifically talking about. So that, I think, is a little bit of background, and then I'll just pass it over to anyone who wants to discuss the nutrition part, maybe.
Yeah, I think getting that soil sample again tells us what's in the bank. pH is really important as we start discussing nutrition in a tissue test. Once, obviously, you got to have a vineyard there. You might use both. We want to use all tools in our toolbox. Data is power, and making sure we sample correctly and that we're using everything that we can. Visual observations, a lot of times it's too late once you start seeing, leaves turning color. You might be able to correct that, maybe not, but some of the damage may have been already, maybe done. Also, as viticulturists, realizing that what we do this year is going to have an impact next year. This is a perennial, long-lived perennial fruit crop. But I like to think of a tissue test as a blood test. So it's important to be collecting soil even once the vineyard's in, but then collecting that tissue test, whether it's just petiole or blade, or you do both. And then again, like you said, we're going to open it up on timing and things like that. But
well, if you want to do the blood test comparison, we have preventative wellness exams as part of our insurance, which
we have to do that soon.
You try to look at changes over time, which is ideal. You catch it before you have a problem. But if you do have a problem, you go to the doctor and get a blood test, and you can diagnose. So you could use it for monitoring nutrition, which is what we want, and you can also diagnose.
That's right.
So you have, I mean, I don't know if it's worth it. I mean, we've talked about whole leaf sampling, blade or petiole. Have we come to a conclusion on that?
Yeah, that it's interesting because if you look back in the literature long ago, there were a number of folks that worked in that area, and I'll briefly comment on what you were alluding to earlier about blade versus petiole is in decontamination is Peter Christensen had quite a number of articles out there where it was a comparison of the two tissues, and they both have their merits. And there's more recent literature that highlights blades as being more accurate with a greater number of nutrients. So there's a greater interest recently, at least here locally, to use blades versus petioles. Blade being the lamina, yes, of the leaf, the part that's the largest, that's pointed, out often towards the sun. It would be the part, maybe if you're applying a nutrient spray, a fungicide, insecticide, that would catch most of it. Petiole being the stem that attaches it to the shoot. And so in some of that early discussion, I know there was a paper in the 80s. I think I was very young at that time, and Peter Christensen was talking about it, and he effectively said petioles are easier to handle because what you want to do ultimately is take a large enough sample across your vineyard area, your block, that's representative. You wouldn't want to just sample a single vine. They're easier to handle and possibly to decontaminate or wash. And so as people became more interested in blades, Fran Pontash, who is retired, she had a position similar to Michael's near me in the Gulf Coast. We said, well, it seems fairly obvious that there's greater potential for contamination from something like a fungicide because they will often contain elemental nutrients. And so we need to make sure that people are properly washing or decontaminating. So, well, let's do a quick little comparison. We'll collect some samples. We'll make a spray application as we normally would around bloom time, which is one of those tissue sampling times. And then we will compare unwashed versus washed, and then we'll decontaminate, and we'll show that, this is what you need to do to get rid of the contaminants. And so we did that, except that our decontamination method that we used was ineffective. So we used mancozeb, which was one of the fungicides applied. It's pretty common, especially that early in the season. It has a long pre-harvest interval. So primarily in that bloom time type sample, it has high concentrations of magnesium and zinc and sulfur as well. And we also saw iron elevated in those sprayed samples. And when we washed them, and we used a phosphate-free dish soap like a Dawn, 3 mils, if I'm not mistaken, per liter. So multiply that times 3.78 if you want to do to gallons, mils per gallon. And when we washed it, we did it for about 15 seconds with our hands, where we were kind of rubbing them together, and it didn't fully remove the contaminants. So if it had been sprayed and unwashed, manganese was something like 750% higher than in the unsprayed leaves. Zinc was about 300%. And so for something like zinc, any micronutrient, you would possibly miss a deficiency if it was elevated that high. And so that would be a concern. And so then we sort of went back to the drawing board and went, oh, geez, we need to figure out how to properly decontaminate. So we went into the literature and went into a bunch of university websites, et cetera. And the recommendations were kind of varied quite a bit. Most of them were fairly generic. The most common was use a phosphate-free detergent, wash in that solution, and then rinse and double rinse in distilled water. Didn't talk about concentrations, didn't talk about agitation or timing. So we went through, long story short, we went through about 6 or 7 iterations of testing different types of, some were detergents, acid solutions, et cetera, to try to find something that's, something a grower could easily implement that's not going to be too time consuming, that would decontaminate these blades. The petioles showed far less contamination. Eventually, long story short, we landed on a baby detergent, something like a Dreft, at 3 mils per liter, agitation time, as in rubbing the tissue between your fingers for about 30 seconds. This is 30 whole leaves in a solution, 30 seconds. Then doing the same thing for about 20 seconds, rinsing each of the double distilled rinse for 20 seconds. And we were able to decontaminate. That being said, those were leaves that were pretty glabrous, didn't have a lot of pubescence. Right. So the next step, we're going to do this one more time this year, I think, and use something that's fairly pubescent. We've got some leaves laid out here, and I don't know if you can see them at all on the camera. One of them is very large. This is Black Spanish Lenoir, one of our common grape varieties. Oh, you're going to demonstrate? I'm gonna, yeah. So you can imagine, and the point of this, as far as grower recommendations, the point being is it's going to take longer to decontaminate a larger leaf like the Black Spanish. The Champanelle he just showed has Vitis labrusca and Champigny in its background. It's very pubescent. It's probably going to take longer to decontaminate those versus something like vinifera that's going to be a little more smooth. Yeah. So we had no intention of going down that rabbit hole, but we did. And ultimately, thus far, what we found particularly for vinifera, is that 3 mils per liter of baby detergent, 30-second agitation time, double distilled rinse, was effectively able to decontaminate. We used mancozeb. We played around with some other fungicides like phosphorus acid. Of course, we had phosphorus contamination, and you can think about some of those fungicides. Potassium bicarbonate,
sodium was one of those.
Sodium contamination was very common, and if we didn't remove our detergent, we had pretty high sodium contamination. Right. The other consideration is you have nutrient sprays. You want to know what went into the leaf, not what's still on the exterior. So still decontamination is important. Dusts, dirt that gets blown up could cause decontamination. And this is not a new discussion. This has been discussed. There are papers from the 1940s and 50s that talk about this. So anyway, it's just important.
And you bring that up, Justin, that it's not new, but there's a lot of new growers. So at the same time, it is new to them. And one thing that I want to point out is, we've always done petiole here in Georgia. So do you need to wash the petioles as well?
Yeah. So we did see contamination on petioles. It was less, but it was still enough I would be concerned about it. Now, that being said, I should say, this was worst case scenario, right? We collected samples, we apply, it was diethane F45, it's got a spreader sticker, at the labeled rate, 4.2 quarts or something like that per 50 gallons of spray. So we had excellent coverage. Yeah. We sampled immediately after, but we also did wait one full week after we sprayed, and it had rained about a half an inch and it was still there. So yes, I would still recommend decontaminating petioles. It would probably be ideal if you had not sprayed immediately before you sampled, because some of that is going to be washed off naturally.
Well, and I think the point is, like we were just talking about, if you're going to, as a grape grower, invest the time to collect this data, soil sampling, tissue sampling, you want to make sure, you get a representative sample across the vineyard block or the entire vineyard property. So making sure you're breaking it up by variety, by area, that maybe have heterogeneity, maybe doing a top sample for soil, subsample, your tissue, making sure you're getting a representative sample there, collecting enough petioles and or blades, and similar to soil with different varieties and things like that. Timing's important, but also washing, making sure you're confident that you are going to get the most accurate results, because you're going to be basing a lot off of that.
Last thing, and I'll shut up, I promise.
No, I have a question for you, actually.
Well, I was just going to say quickly, as far as representation, I have a observation from my own place. I've got 1.5 acres or so of grapes and fruit. And when I soil sampled, I did, top 8 inches and 8 to 16 inches. And in the top 8 inches, I had very little boron in the soil. But in the lower profile, I had almost toxic, or beyond the
range.
it was high. So had I only sampled the top 8 inches, I might have been applying boron when it wasn't necessarily needed. So you want to have a good representation of the site, of the grapes, of the soil, wherever you're sampling.
Absolutely.
Nathan, to keep on this topic, there was a question in the Q&A, and it is about decontamination. So I'm going to read it. Will the lab decontaminate the blades when you send them in?
So that was one of the reasons one of the reasons why we started down that road as well. Because as visiting with some of the growers, they said, well, the lab will decontaminate the samples for us. And I said, well, are you sending fresh samples or dried samples? Because if you go to like a plant analysis handbook, which is written more geared toward labs and talks about protocols, they will say to decontaminate samples while the tissue is still fully turgid, so it's not dried down. And then you want to do it rapidly so as not to remove any soluble nutrients. And I forgot to mention, we did try some other detergents that actually stripped out nutrients. So you can overdo it with washing. So I can't speak for those individual labs, but my sense is if they are decontaminating, you're going to need to send fresh samples, which have a much shorter shelf life because of molds and things like that. Typically, we're drying them down and sending them in a breathable bag.
Yeah, and that's a great question. I would say confirm with the lab you use, and double check and ask them what their protocol is, not just if they actually will wash those samples and decontaminate.
Do y'all know, are you going to give it one more year on this research, or do y'all already have a protocol for this already?
I shouldn't tell them myself, but we did this. And like I said, we had no desire to really go down that road, but we ended up doing it, and it turned out it was useful exercise. And so I said, okay, well, let's put this in Catalyst, which, if you recall, for a period of time, there was a journal, Catalyst, from the American Society of Enology and Viticulture. And so I wrote it for Catalyst over the Christmas holidays, and it's a totally different format compared to almost every journal. And then I got an email about a week before I submitted that said Catalyst is being rolled into ASEV-ES. And so I haven't had time to reformat, but what we decided to do is go ahead and take something that's pubescent. We have this grape Champanelle, and go ahead and test it. My gut is it's probably not going to be fully effective. It very well may be, but it would be good to know. And then we will ultimately want to put this out in something like American Journal for Enology and Viticulture. Have an article coming out here in one of the trade magazines pretty soon. And we have a protocol fact sheet that we put out last year. That's just basically, here's a quick step-by-step process.
You do have one, a fact sheet.
We do, but that's the consideration is it's particular to these varieties of grapes. So I'm unsure about grapes that have very rough texture or ones that are very pubescent.
And one thing we talked about when we were preparing for this discussion is it's not really even a matter of time that y'all found still significant contaminant levels of those fungicides a week, 10 days later. Sometime had passed where you think, oh, I'll let the rain wash it off, and then I'll do my tissue sampling prior to my next spray regimen. But that was not the case.
Well, this is almost a commercial for Dithane F45 because it was very tenacious, because the first time we sampled and we used acetone dish detergent, it was not effective. We actually did it again, and we tried to wash it off twice. We ran it through that same protocol twice, and it still was not effective. So it depends upon what you're applying, of course. I mean, if you were just applying sulfur, I would probably be less concerned. We applied Pristine as one of the sprays. And if you look at the chemical structure, that was one of the things we did, is we looked at the structure and said, okay, does it have some sort of, what would be a nutrient within the structure, an elemental nutrient? And pyraclostrobin, I do not believe has much, maybe some nitrogen. Boscolid doesn't either. These active ingredients, but it was the clay carrier I was curious about, because a lot of these fungicides have a clay carrier. It's like, well, maybe you're going to get some contamination from that. Really didn't see it so much. So it's going to be particular to your area and what you're applying. So on the West Coast, probably presumably not going to be as much of an issue, or in western part of Texas, for example, they don't apply as many plant protectant products versus the eastern part of the state.
When they're growing vinifera, so that's similar to what you were looking at. But yeah, Nathan, to answer your question, we're working on that. We just confirmed with a collaborator in East Texas growing champanelle to carry this study forward and look at things a little broader with some larger leaf and then the pubescent. So we hope to have a more complete recommendation within the next year. So we're excited about that.
If I could just interject, because there's another question in the Q&A,
Yes.
and you had talked a little bit about the agitation for 30 seconds and then a double rinse, but it asked, how long does it take to decontaminate all of the leaves just for one sample?
Yeah, that's the challenge, right? Is we have this large leaf of Black Spanish, and if you're sampling at bloom, the leaves are going to generally be larger than if you're sampling the post bloom, maybe closer to veraison, because you're sampling at a different location. So I would spend a little more time on, or maybe add fewer blades to the solution. So we have some right here, little 2-gallon buckets, and would add a gallon or two of water to add the tissue in, and then we were physically rubbing.
Yeah, show how you would do it.
I don't think it's going to.
You guys are cracking up. This is
We can do a demo.
Please demo.
So you would have this bucket filled up. You'd have the detergent.
So this would be our detergent solution, we'll say. And then we would have one more bucket that would have distilled water. The deal is with tap water, if you were in College Station, oh my gosh, you're going to get all kinds of sodium in your tap water and would possibly contaminate your sample and possibly other things. So preferably you're using, distilled. And so you have your leaves in there together and you're physically rubbing them. And we were trying to be as quick as possible. Again, we weren't doing this to try to, develop a protocol for our purposes, but something that people who are doing this, for a living.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I'm not going to say I'm not busy, but they're in a hurry, and you want them to have what is the minimum way to decontaminate. And so we did 30 seconds, 30 whole leaves like this, 30 seconds of rubbing, just grabbing them and rubbing them together, swishing it around. And then afterwards you pull them out, you're sort of flinging the water off, of the samples, and then going into the rinse buckets, doing something similar for about 20 seconds where you're rubbing them, because they're kind of sticking together often and you will have soap between them. And if you're not careful with the rinse, what we saw is a lot of sodium contamination.
It's like the tortellini when you're cooking them and they're sticking together and you try to break them up, that just came to mind.
All right. So yeah, you stir your tortellini and you just want to make sure and get them clean. And then you go to the second one. When you're done, you fling the water off, you lay them out typically, and we blot them dry. And then we dried them out after that point, and they're stable once they're dried out. But what we did also, and we didn't really collect much data on this, but you could actually start to see suds in these rinse buckets pretty quickly. So we switched out new solution every time. That being said, if you're going to take a sample in your vineyard, depending upon how large of an area you want to represent, you might actually take quite a number more leaf blades. You may take double that number, so it may take twice as long. Petioles, of course, they're much smaller. One reason why it would be easier to handle a larger sample is you can take a larger sample easier of petioles, and they can be decontaminated more quickly.
Yeah.
It's a trade-off is what it comes down to. We still use petioles. We have people that use petioles only. We have people that have moved to blades. There tends to be less generally information of ranges for blades or recommendations. And then we have a lot of people that do both, because part of it is comparing to what the recommendations are, but also a lot of it has to do with changes over time. Right. If you start to see a decrease over time, you would want to possibly get ahead of it before you actually have a deficiency where you can visually see symptoms, because presumably vine performance at that point has started to decline.
Well, I think that was really important too for especially new growers out there, trying to compile all this data over time to start making, decisions over time as well. If you're playing around with petiole versus blade or both, making sure that you can test things, but stick with what you're going to do every year so that you can start compiling this historical log and tracking that over time. Because if you do petiole one year and then blade the next year and blade the next year, then petiole, and you're trying to make, decisions long-term and looking at the history, it's going to be very convoluted, I guess you could say. So you may play around and see what works for you, what you're happy with, but stick with that same testing. And we're talking when you're looking at general trends, maybe not, oh, I'm seeing some crazy color in my leaves in a certain block, I'm going to take samples then. We're talking when you're doing your annual or every 2-year sampling to try to look at trends.
I think we probably discussed this before we started the meeting. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's all a guide. You still have to, it's still good to get out and visually inspect the vines, because I gave an example of muscadine grapes. They're native to the eastern part of Texas, to acid sandy soils primarily. We grow them in our research vineyard in a silt loam, and the pH is 8 to 8.2. And so iron in particular is less available under those conditions, and they show severe iron deficiency and they're very stunted. However, if you take tissue, you will see 2 to 3x the concentration we have, at least, of iron compared to the bunch grapes. And so they're able to remove it from the soil, but it's in an unusable form. So if you just relied solely on the tissue test, iron is one of those ones where visual is also important.
Right.
I have a real naive question, probably. So we're talking about this in the context of decontaminating the samples that you're sending to the lab, but what about the vine? Like, there's no chance of uptake of the manganese or the zinc.
That's a good question.
On the decontaminated vine, is there? Or
yeah. So it depends upon the particular spray that you're talking about. Something like a phosphorus acid spray, that's systemic. So some of these are contact and they stay on the outside, or at least they're supposed to. And if they don't, a lot of times they cause phytotoxicity or burn the leaves. So something like a phosphorus acid presumably would go into the leaf and would be part of that analysis. But what we would be trying to do is remove any that's on the surface that has not penetrated. Okay. Same would be true for nutrient. Like it's not uncommon to apply a micronutrient to the canopy to try to it's a relatively low concentration that you can get into the plant. But if it's a micronutrient, you may only need a very, very small amount. What we want to know is what got in versus what stayed on the outside. So you'd still want to wash off anything on the exterior.
Gotcha.
And the basic, I think the takeaway too, we're going to have to continue moving down our outline here, but is identifying that could be a risk of contamination, that there is a process. Number two, as Michael pointed out, contact your lab to understand how they want to accept those, because do you need to dry those out after you decontaminate them, and because they want dried samples, or you just put them in we put them in brown paper bags and just send them in. And so just making sure they know what form to be received in. And then most universities, and hopefully we're all very similar in our publications, petioles used to be 30 to 50 petioles per block, per sample of a certain area. Does that sound similar to whole leaf or the leaf blade?
Yeah, I mean, that if it were a very uniform block, I'd probably be comfortable with that. But we have quite a bit of variability, particularly in our state, and probably just the East period, because of all the potential disease problems, and other reasons why. Could be the soil itself. But over time, you end up with maybe different vine ages and different vine status from maybe water and nutrition.
A lot of variability.
And so the more variability, you either ideally would be able to, and now I'm getting into y'all's lane over here, ideally you'd be able to recognize that and sample accordingly, or you would take a larger sample, which is what we currently do. Ultimately, what we'd love to be able to do is map that out. And I'll stop there because y'all can talk much more about being able to identify that variability.
Well, that's a good segue there, Justin. And so the next part of this is, and Justin alluded to it earlier, and we'll let Terry and Jennifer. And by the way, we have on here Randall Voss, who's in the participation list, but I think I allowed Randall to become a panelist if he wants to. Randall's a small fruits specialist in Iowa State University, and Randall, feel free to pop in, say something, comment, anything you need to. So I wanted to acknowledge Randall being on this call. But so Terry, we mentioned before is the standard, and we said the standard that we're using is the wine grape production guide for Eastern North America. And you had a role in setting that standard. So we've taken the sample, we've got our analysis. Now it's the interpretation and interpreting that variability and spatial variability. And let's just kind of play off of that a little bit. And Jennifer, feel free to pipe in, whoever wants to go first.
Okay. Okay,
Terry.
thanks. Yep. Okay, so first, I already talked about that. Look at vineyard nutrient supply, uptake, and demand. And those things are very locally specific, right? What's your vineyard soils like? What's your rooting depth? Biological properties. Uptake. We talk about different rootstocks and different rootstocks being able to take up plants in amounts. There are some rootstocks that are potassium accumulators, some that are good acid soils that'll pick up magnesium and phosphorus. And then so are you growing Concord at 10 tons per acre in Western New York, or, another variety, Pinot Noir at 2 tons per acre in Maryland somewhere? It's like those types of supply, uptake, and demand issues are locally specific. And then what we try to get at with the high-res vineyard nutrition project is to even make it more, temporally and spatially specific. So how can we use sensors to measure the soil, canopy growth, possible nutrient status of the vine, and match that up with like yield and pruning weight to put all those together for our overall vineyard nutrient management picture. When it comes to the kind of like the analogy of the blood test, so I was fortunate enough to work with Tony Wolf on the nutrition. And I agree.
Hey, Terry.
The appendix. Yes.
Can I pause you for a second?
Yep.
We're getting a little bit of interruption on your cell phone. Is there any better space we can get a better signal?
Ooh, I don't know. So we're having great internet issues at work, and it's like bleeding over into the cell service. So I will
stand next to a
and see
window.
Yeah, I already am. In fact, I'm going to move right on outside.
You're coming in a little bit clear now. I just wanted to catch you. Go ahead. You can resume.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, our service is like not doing so well right now. Okay.
That's better.
So those numbers really came from Tony Wolf initiated it, and there was a group of us viticulturists in the Eastern U.S. They got together and put our heads together on what the best ranges. So we started with I think most of us all had taken advanced plant nutrition classes in college, so we had an idea what was going on. But we looked at work at Pete Christensen, Eric Hansen from Michigan State, Nelson Shawless from Cornell University, and started with the numbers that they had. And then we looked at, each of us, we were all doing nutrition projects at the time. I was working on soil pH and nutrient levels, and we were doing vine excavation studies. So we were looking at what our current research was. And then we were also, one of the people on the team was Paul Chu from A&L Labs, and he had thousands and thousands of samples from the lab. So we were putting all that information together to come up with, the best ranges possible. So very much like a blood test, if you're a healthy person, you go to the doctor once a year, you get a physical, they do a blood test, and they look at your, high density lipoprotein level. and there's ranges, and if you're within a healthy range, okay, you're doing all right. But when you start to creep out of that range, usually what they do is they give you some kind of, remediation, give you a supplemental material, a medicine or something to try to correct your cholesterol level. But really, the next thing they do is they say you need to change your habits, your lifestyle to get you back into a range. And it's very similar with vineyards. You're first using it as a diagnostic tool, and if you're in the sufficiency range, you're okay. And if you're starting to creep out of that range, you first apply a fertilizer, but then you want to look at what the underlying problem is that's causing that deficiency to happen and try to fix it, so you're not just pouring on fertilizers all the time. So that's where all those numbers come from. And again, they're very locally specific. I like the comment about if you're going to take petioles on your own vineyard or leaf blades on your own vineyard, stay consistent. Use those tissues year after year and start building your own database where in a particular variety that say it's potassium. So maybe the ranges that we have published be skewed a little bit for your own particular vineyard and your own particular variety on your own particular rootstock. And so it's really good to kind of do your own on-farm experimentation. Okay, so let's get down to actual tissues, because I know this is a hot topic. It's a hot topic, which I don't think should be a hot topic. Again, it's to me, where you sample in the vineyard, so using your spatial data to get the most appropriate sample is probably much better than whether or not you're choosing between petioles or leaves. The error in your sampling from a location standpoint is much greater than the error you're going to get in your tissue samples. Okay, so having said that, long preface for this discussion on leaves versus petioles. So in the project that we have, the High Res Vineyard Nutrition Project, and work that we've been doing with Rob Chancia at our RIT. So we have a vineyard plot, so 1 acre plot, but we've divided it into quarter acres where we have a healthy check vineyard. Then we have one that's nitrogen deficient, one that's potassium deficient, and then one that we have at a low soil pH, which is common in our area, and that induces several different nutrient deficiencies, phosphorus, magnesium, and even nitrogen, just because the vines end up having some pretty poor growth under low soil pH. And in that plot, we actually sample individual vines, have 100 individual count vines where we collect petioles and leaves at veraison and at bloom. Like, we keep every vine sample separate. We're not sampling from an area. It's 50 petioles off of one vine. So you can imagine, like, we're taking a lot of canopy away when we're doing these tissue and nutrient analysis. So we send those in and get them analyzed, but then we also match it up with viticulture metrics like yield and pruning weight, and then we start to look at the correlations. So I think it's important to understand we take our samples at either bloom or veraison, and you have to understand what's going on in the vine. So, and especially for shorter growing season areas like we have here in Western New York, and those growing seasons get extended, like when you move down into Texas. But in New York, when you're talking about bloom samples, you're really talking about that the vines are remobilizing any nutrients that they have stored in the vine. We've done nutrient uptake studies with Leilang Chang at Cornell, and we show less than 5% fertilizer uptake pre-bloom. So, like, the vines hardly take, if you put your fertilizer on pre-bloom, it's hardly taking any of it up. It's really working off the reserves stored in the perennial structures of the vine up until bloom. So when you take a tissue sample at bloom time, it's reflective of that reserve status. And what we find is that the bloom time tissue samples are very reflective of last year's pruning weight, so which is reflective of how well that vine did last year. So if you're looking at like gross nutrient status of your vineyard, you can take those tissues samples at bloom. It gives you kind of an idea where's the high stuff, where's the low stuff, and you can use that in your management plan. When it comes to leaf blades versus petioles, and I know Rob Chancia can back me up on this, there's super highly correlated. So whether we take a petiole sample or a leaf blade, the values are different. You know, they tend to be higher in the blades than in the petioles, but they're highly correlated. The ones that have high, you know, leaf blade tissue values, they're also going to be high in the petioles. When we correlate that with last year's pruning weight, the leaf blades are a little better than the petioles. So, I mean, that could argue for edging out, you know, take the blades over the petioles. But the two of them are so highly correlated, it actually really doesn't matter. When it comes to, I see this as an advantage because now as Justin said, we have all this data on petioles and we have very little data on leaf blades. But since they're so highly correlated, we can translate those and start coming up with, you know, what we think are reasonable values for blades by using what we have already for petioles. So I guess bottom line there for me is I don't care which tissue you take. They're both indicative of the vine reserve nutrient status and reflective of like last year's pruning weight. You have a question?
Go ahead, Jennifer.
I was just going to ask a question then of Terry. So we don't have a lot of that standard to look towards leaf blades. Can we actually use like the production guide for the Northeast and your recommendations for petioles to interpret? Is that what you're saying? We can use that and be very close to the leaf blades as we're giving recommendations.
Yeah. So we need to put that data together. We've done it now for 3, and that. So yeah, it'll be 4 years this year that we're doing that. Although I don't think we're taking blades this year. Anyways, we can use the data we have from the last 3 years to come up with what is that relationship between petioles and blades, and then just, translate what's published in the production guide, or we'll just publish something new that has both petioles and blade values in it for target values.
Well, I think the underlying theme is everybody needs to be sampling to have that baseline. So knowing what's going on historically in that vineyard once those vines are established, it can be pretty important. So if we need to make an adjustment, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was going to move on to the veraison discussion.
Well, I guess my question is whenever we sample, you know, as Michael said, if you sample during veraison, you're kind of treating the symptoms. Hopefully that's going to go into storage for the vine for the winter. Then, as you say, can pull out the reserves next year. So if we're seeing deficiencies, there's lots of products. Obviously there's the soil that you'd think we'd be investing in the bank as we go back to the monetary example. But there's also a lot of foliar fertility treatments, and just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so when we sample tissue at veraison, it's more indicative of what the current stress situation is on the vine. So somewhere about bloom, you're switching over from nutrient reserves to new nutrient uptake. So if for whatever reason you have poor nutrient uptake, maybe the root's got attacked by a pest, or we have water and you don't have good nutrient uptake during the season, that tends to be reflected in the veraison sampling. And so kind of the interesting thing there is when we relate veraison, leaf and blade, they're correlated, but not as strongly as they were at bloom. And when we look at viticulture metrics, the petioles are more indicative of the stress status of the vine. And so everyone uses this analogy of the leaf is the sink and the petiole is the pipe. And if you think about it, the leaves are like not just a physical sink of like you're thinking about filling up a sink of water, but they're a sink for those nutrients. So if I have sufficient nitrogen, it's shuttling nitrogen into the leaf so it can make chlorophyll and do photosynthesis. If I'm under a little bit of nutrient stress, it's still trying to shuttle nitrogen into that leaf to make chlorophyll so that you can still do it. So you tend to see less variation in the leaf tissues. And then in the blades, you're actually getting that reflection of if I have high nitrogen status, I have high nitrogen in the petioles. If I have low instantaneous nitrogen status, I have low nitrogen in the petioles. So the petioles actually, the pipe analogy actually works out pretty good because it's telling you kind of instantaneously what's going on. where the leaf blade itself is trying really hard to accumulate those nutrients to do the job that it needs to do for the plant. So whether or not you can correct it, if anything, you could correct it. Yes, there are growers in our area that use late season foliar feeds, especially potassium. So we have an issue in our, again, very localized situation where we're growing Concord in an unirrigated system, and when we run high crop levels, we can quickly run into potassium deficiency. And there are products out there that growers are spraying potassium on the vines, mid to late season to try to make sure they have enough potassium. Like, I tend to look at my, my soil, my tissue values, my cropping level in my management system, and I try to correct those potassium problems by ground applied fertilizers, which is, from an efficiency standpoint, is better. From a timing standpoint, it's sluggish. So, sometimes there's those emergency situations where you need to spray it on the leaves and fix your problem.
Well, and something, Terry, that you mentioned, that you were kind of breaking up when you said it, but, it comes down to production goals. This session here is covering the entire United States pretty much. So, whether you're growing Concord and Finger Lakes, or, in the South doing something different, what are you trying to yield off that plant? And, what are your soils producing? So you got that supply, uptake, and demand. The plant's demanding one thing, but if you didn't have it in your soil, obviously it's not there to take, and we need to address that. So that production goals, supply, uptake, and demand is kind of one of our key takeaways from this, that we really need to be, a lot of times, even in Georgia, we're still trying to figure out what all we can grow. And so somebody will clear cut a forest and plant vine in the fall and plant vines there in the spring. And that's a kind of a no-no
Yeah.
because we've not taken the proper time to rest the soils, cover crop them, get things where they need to be. We're just kind of heavily amending with lime, phosphorus, potassium, and planting. So all that to say is it's going to take several years before we know what the supply uptake margins are going to be for that plant and what the yield can be.
Yeah, one of the quotes Bob Poole used to tell me all the time is that maximum is not optimum in viticulture for just about any decision that you make. We have dairy farmers that try to take a part of their field and turn it into a vineyard, and all they do is grow, they grow leaves from here to Texas.
I'm gonna give it is Randall or Jennifer, and then Rob. I want us to transition into kind of just a snapshot of some of this, and give Rob a chance to talk on some of the work that he's doing. Randall, is there anything you want to add to the conversation thus far? Give you an opportunity.
I guess the only thing I would kind of add is, when you do get these samples back, be sure you're kind of looking at the sufficiency ranges. Different labs have different sufficiency ranges of what is normal or what is good for grape petioles or grape leaves. And so I just encourage people to, reference back to those grape production guides to make sure the lab you're using is using the guidelines that are kind of standard for the industry, because there's some proprietary ones out there too that are like way higher in nitrogen than kind of what those guidelines are saying is ideal.
I think that's a great point. And it's okay to ask your labs what they base their guidelines on. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and maybe choose your lab accordingly too, right? I know some labs, a couple labs will give out two different guidelines depending on who's sending in the samples too. So, and every now and then they do make a mistake too, where they accidentally use, a different crop by accident on the sufficiency range. And so don't just look at high, medium, low. You want to kind of look back at what they're using, make sure it makes sense, and interpret it too.
Appreciate that. That's a good tip. All right, Rob and Jennifer. Rob, we got My Efficiency Vineyard again. If y'all want to learn more about the new technologies and things that are coming, that's going to be on August 8th. Please join us then during that hang time session. But real quick, Rob, give us and I'm just trying to spread the love here.
Sure.
You and Jennifer talked. Terry, you've had your moment, even though I know you're on the team. I'm just picking at you. So give us a little bit about this imaging and sensory data and layers that you are having to look at.
Yeah, I would say just to keep the analogy going, if your nutrient tissue sampling is like the blood test, the sensing with a satellite or a drone is like your mom putting her hand on your forehead and telling you to stay home or not. It's it's not super precise, and it's really hard given the variety of vines and different management strategies that people have to come up with a general model for nutrition from remote sensing data. But what we can do is provide a good variable map that you can then go out in the field and look and sample from and figure out what's wrong.
And that helps dial in if you're going to do some sort of variable rate nutrition application. So you may be taking that same amount of nitrogen that you're applying, but putting it more directed to the vines that need more instead of one application across the field.
And that's the name of the game. And that's the kind of another takeaway point that I want the audience to walk away with is variability in the vineyard, spatial patterns. It's just the way that nutrition is being addressed, whether you're in row crops or vineyard management. As it's already been discussed, different regions of the state are going to have different soils. Even on your own vineyard, there could be spatial variability in soils and uptake availability. And we don't even want to get down the rabbit hole of different, like I said, root stocks and scion wood and clones and all these variabilities that could potentially have that influence as well. You have to be realistic of what you have available in your toolbox at your disposal. That's realistic. But I think a common theme here is record keeping and trying to identify that spatial variability. And anybody at your universities, and if they can't help you specifically, feel free to reach out to one of the panelists here on how to identify. Now, what is it that are the characteristics? Okay, it's geographic spatial variability in soils. We have obviously your varietal types. And then we can kind of go from there and break it down even further. But that spatial variability, and that's where the technology is going. Rob's looking at these layers, and the hope is in the future, as Terry said, or somebody mentioned in our pre-game, was we could get to know before we know somehow. And maybe that's a long ways away, but the technology, I would dare to say, Rob, correct me if I'm not wrong, is coming along pretty quickly.
Yeah, especially on the satellite end of things, data's near daily now over your vineyards, whether you want it or not. Someone's taking it. It's just a matter of getting it into everyone's hands.
We got a couple of questions that we'll conclude on. I'm going to extend this about 5 more minutes because we did get about 5 minutes late start. If you, we'll try to make these quick answers if possible. If you add in a post-decontamination handling, this can be very slow if you have many cultivars for samples. Petiole, let's see, okay. Yeah, talking about the timing of that could take a while depending on how much collection you're doing. And I think we acknowledge that, but we also want to acknowledge the possibilities. Second question from Paul is guidance on foliar applications of nitrogen, rates, timing during bloom time. Are there phototoxicity concerns? So who wants to discuss nitrogen application? Who's our nitrogen? Is that be Terry?
I'm looking at you, Randall, with your smile.
To me, the whole nitrogen thing gets down to, are you trying to bump your growth? Are you trying to increase your yan? And to me, if you're trying to increase your growth, my advice would be a soil application of nitrogen, really. And so if you're fine with your vigor of your plants and you're trying to increase your yan, sure, then foliar nitrogen is a great option. So it probably just gets down to, what is your goal?
I'm going to keep rolling here. If I'm collecting a sample during barrage and the protocol says the fully developed leaf below the apex, so 2 to 3 leaves below the apex, but how do I determine that the leaf is a full-sized leaf?
Yeah, the rule of thumb is that it's 80% of its full size, which doesn't really answer your question very well. I think the rationale behind that is you want to avoid young leaves because they either are a sink or not, depends on the nutrient you're looking at. You want to avoid basal leaves. And this is specific for a lot of the work that Nelson Shawless did with potassium, is that potassium is a mobile element in the shoot. And so if you start to see potassium deficiency, you're going to see it on the basal leaves first. So he was actually, if you were really concerned about potassium, like always sample the basal leaves. They're going to tell you first if you are heading towards potassium deficiency, but that never makes it into the recommends because we're trying to look at all nutrients. So you really want to avoid super old leaves and super young leaves. So you're trying to get a consistent sample of those like mid-shoot leaves that are, you know, they're sources of photosynthesis and they haven't yet started to senesce. I don't know if that makes sense.
And for the most part, Terry, they also have that really good coloring. So the newer leaves are much lighter and the older leaves, as you said, could start exhibiting some of those nutrient deficiencies. So they're going to be that color that you're looking for at a healthy leaf for the ones that you want to take.
Yeah, you can kind of see that color change and the waxiness, you know, from the young going to more mature.
We have another question. Have you, going back to the nitrogen from Roman, have you compared vine nutrition deficiency with YAN deficiency in the juice? Is there a correlation? Do we have anybody that
Who's that a question for?
Well, anybody that wants it. So does YAN deficiency correlate to vine deficiency?
So there was some work done at Cornell. It was Alan Laxo, Lei Lang Chang. They were looking at this YAN situation in Riesling in the Finger Lakes, and the answer ended up being, so they put nitrogen on the ground, they sprayed it on the leaves, they did different rates, and the answer came down to they needed to irrigate the vines. So it was a matter of that the vines were water stressed, and that was screwing up the nitrogen like uptake and conversion for YAN. But there's, yeah, I'm just going to stop there because that's really not my area. We did some work with Concord putting on foliar nitrogen late in the season, but that was after the fruit had been harvested. We were trying to pump the vines up with nitrogen, and the bottom line answer with that is yes, we could do it. We could spray nitrogen on the leaves. It would go into the cane tissue, and then it was the first nitrogen that was out in the spring. So it was kind of like last in from the leaves senescing and remobilizing that nitrogen back into the plant. So the last laid down was the first nitrogen to come out. But like overall, it didn't really affect any other viticulture parameters. Like, you know, it didn't lead to higher set or higher like floret number or anything like that.
Is there a difference in uptake between liquid ammonium nitrate and dry granular ammonium nitrate? I mean, I might be able to take somewhat of a stab. I did my graduate studies on that. I mean, granular versus liquid, they both have to be watered in, as you said, and kind of moved into the soil. Granular, you can get quite a bit of volatilization. You know, would want to be putting out any granulars right prior to a rain event. And then the liquid, even the same thing, if it's being liquid, depending on how much water you're putting down with it, would still need to be moved down to the soil profile. If I'm off on that,
No, you're right. That's exactly how I would have answered that. Is any granular stuff is essentially a salt, and you have to get water on it to get it to dissolve and go into the soil profile. And even volatilization, once it makes it into the soil, it'll volatilize and then it'll precipitate like back into the soil. So it's only the nitrogen that sits there on top of the field in very hot, dry, windy conditions where you get a ton of volatilization that you'd be concerned about.
Well, guys and gals, that's kind of the time that we have today. Here's what I want y'all to do. I mean, the questions have rolled in. This has been a great topic, and I think people have appreciated the decontamination discussion, and just understanding this supply, uptake, and demand concept and spatial variability. I hope those are the things that kind of resonate with you after today's talk. But you know, Michael Cook, and Justin from Texas A&M. You can email them if you have specific questions. Randall Voss, Iowa State University. Rob, Jennifer, and Terry are all working around Cornell area to address some of these things with some of the technologies and different concepts and these standards as we talked about. So, you know, if y'all want to reach out to these people, I encourage you to. We're here to serve everybody. And we want to thank y'all. Thank you, panelists, for today, for this discussion. We could probably keep going for another 30 minutes, but we do gotta cut it. But we hope that the attendees have enjoyed this. You'll probably be prompted with a quick survey at the end when you end the meeting. If you'll take your time to fill that survey out, give us a little bit of feedback, that helps us with future discussions and whether we made an impact today. Panelists, thank y'all so much for your time. Great discussion. And with that, I am going to conclude. We are off the hang time next month because we'll be at our conference. And we will pick back up August 8th talking about new technologies. And hopefully Jennifer can join us again to dive a little bit more deeper into some of these different technologies and things we're trying to do nationally together and collaboratively. So perfect. All right, everybody. Y'all have a wonderful day, and we will talk to you later.
Great.